The chandelier above us glimmered like a constellation, casting its polished light over the long table where the Vaughn family sat in all their practiced elegance. I could hear the faint chime of silver forks against porcelain plates, the low hum of polite conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter that seemed too rehearsed to be genuine. It was Alexander's night, after all. His engagement dinner was another carefully orchestrated performance where the family's pride would be paraded and polished until it shone like gold. I sat at the far end of the table, not too far to be forgotten completely, but far enough to be framed as an afterthought. From this seat I could see them all, my parents, stiff-backed in their tailored clothes, Alexander radiant in his element, and Madeline, his fiancée, glowing with the kind of beauty that made heads turn even when she did nothing at all. It was the kind of seating arrangement that had defined my life since childhood. I was close enough to witness the glory, but never the one basking in it. My cousin leaned toward me, the same cousin who barely remembered that I had graduated years ago. Her smile was thin, her voice coated in that polite curiosity people use when they are filling silence. "So what have you been doing these days, Alois?" she asked. Without waiting for an answer, she added, "You know, my firm is always looking for bright minds. Something stable, entry-level of course, but it would be a good start for you." A good start. I almost laughed. If she knew how many sleepless nights I had stacked behind me, if she knew the storms I had already walked through, she would not have spoken the words so casually. But I only smiled, nodded, and let the comment float away like smoke. It was easier than explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen. My father was at the other end, raising his glass in a toast to Alexander. His words flowed with the ease of someone used to being heard. Alexander's accomplishments, his publications, his patience, his devotion to medicine, it all spilled from my father's lips like scripture. My mother followed with her own memory of Alexander as a boy, standing proudly at a science fair with his ribbon pinned to his shirt. Her voice caught with emotion, and the guests applauded warmly. No one turned to me. No one asked what I had achieved, what I had built, or what my days were filled with. Their silence was louder than any applause. Madeline caught my attention when she scrolled through her phone between courses. She leaned toward one of her colleagues at the table and said something about an acquisition deal her firm was negotiating. I recognized the description immediately, though she never said the company's name. My pulse stuttered, but my face stayed perfectly calm. She was talking about us. About me. I sipped my wine slowly, forcing myself to stay composed. I had spent years building my life in silence, away from their eyes and their judgment. And now here, at a dinner meant to celebrate my brother's perfect life, the secret I had protected for so long brushed against the surface, threatening to spill out. Madeline's eyes flickered toward me once, sharp and searching, as if something about me tugged at her memory. Then she smiled at Alexander, kissed his cheek, and went back to her phone. The moment passed. For now, I could feel my mother's gaze sliding toward me every so often, assessing my dress, my posture, the way I held my fork. She had called me earlier in the week to remind me to dress appropriately. Madeline's family is accomplished, Alois. We want to present well, which had always been her code for, do not embarrass us. So I had chosen a black dress, fitted and understated, something that made me feel grounded. It was not armor, because I did not need armor anymore. I had become the armor. The courses continued, each dish served with an elegance that seemed unnecessary, each toast circling back to Alexander, his brilliance, his future. I let the sound wash over me, let it bounce harmlessly against the wall I had built inside myself, because I knew something they did not. They saw me as the quiet one, the lost one, the daughter who had never quite lived up to the family standard. They saw Alexander as the star, Madeline as the perfect addition, themselves as the architects of success. But what they could not see, what they had never cared to see, was the truth I carried quietly inside me. It struck me then, as the laughter swelled again at the far end of the table. Secrets have a way of rising. No matter how deeply you bury them, no matter how carefully you guard them, they find their way to the surface. And mine was closer than anyone here realized. As dessert was served and champagne glasses refilled, I leaned back in my chair and studied the glittering faces around me. My family had no idea who I really was, and soon, whether I wanted it or not, they were going to find out. The waiter moved silently behind me, pouring another half glass of champagne. I thanked him softly, though my voice was lost in the hum of conversation. The air smelled faintly of roses and roasted lamb, an odd combination that clung to the fabric of my dress. I touched the stem of my glass, cool beneath my fingers, and wondered how long I could sit there before someone forced me into the spotlight I had spent years avoiding. At the head of the table, Alexander was telling a story about a patient he had treated, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm. Guests leaned in as if he were delivering a sermon. He had always known how to hold a room, how to make his work sound larger than life. I remembered being children, him reciting entire passages of books aloud just to hear himself praised, while I sat in the corner with my notebooks, sketching out ideas no one cared to see. Some habits, it seemed, never changed. I reached for the bread basket, more out of distraction than hunger. The crust broke beneath my fingers, scattering crumbs across my plate. My cousin on my right leaned closer again. "You know," she whispered conspiratorially, "Alexander really is remarkable. He is going to change the world one day." I smiled, nodding as though I agreed. What I wanted to say was that I had already changed part of it. Quietly, invisibly, in ways that had saved lives my family never even heard about. But her eyes were not asking me for truth. They were only fishing for agreement, for a continuation of the hymn they all seemed intent on singing. So I swallowed the words. My mother cleared her throat then, drawing attention back to the middle of the table. She complimented Madeline's dress, her composure, her career. Madeline responded graciously, her voice confident, her posture impeccable. She was exactly the kind of woman my mother had always wanted me to emulate. Sophisticated, accomplished, seamlessly folded into society's definition of success. Between courses, Madeline once again glanced at her phone. I caught a fragment of her words when she leaned toward Alexander. "The deal should close soon," she murmured. "The valuation is higher than expected, but our analysts believe it is justified." My chest tightened. The words sat between us like a secret only I understood. She was talking about my company, about the years I had spent hunched over a laptop in dim rooms, eating takeout, writing code until my vision blurred. About the prototypes tested, the contracts fought for, the sleepless nights stitched together by stubborn belief. All of it was now a line item in her acquisition report. I kept my expression still, only lifting my glass to my lips. If she had looked at me then, really looked, maybe she would have seen the flicker in my eyes, but she didn't. She turned instead to Alexander, pressing her hand into his arm as she laughed at something he said. My father began another toast. He spoke about legacy, about family honor, about the pride he felt in Alexander's accomplishments. His words rose like smoke, filling every corner of the hall. I listened, and for a moment I felt the old sting of being invisible, the weight of years spent trying and failing to be recognized by the people sitting only feet away from me. But then something shifted inside me. It was not anger. It was not longing. It was the cool clarity of knowing I no longer needed them to see me. Recognition was no longer my hunger. I had fed myself with something stronger. I looked around the table, at the polished smiles and glimmering eyes, at the chandeliers reflected in the wine glasses, at Alexander glowing beneath the praise that fell so easily into his lap. And I thought, none of you know who I am. None of you know what I have built. Dessert arrived on small porcelain plates, delicate tarts topped with sugared berries. Guests murmured appreciatively, forks sliding through cream and crust. I tasted mine without noticing its flavor. My mind was elsewhere, circling around the truth that pressed at the edges of the evening. When coffee was served, Madeline raised her cup with a smile. "To family," she said warmly, "and to futures worth building." A chorus of agreement rose around the table. Cups clinked, spoons chimed, voices overlapped in celebration. I lifted my cup too, though the words tasted different in my mouth. To family, to futures, to truths that cannot be hidden forever. As the evening wound down, chairs scraped softly against the marble floor. Guests gathered their coats, exchanged final embraces, offered congratulations once more to Alexander and Madeline. My parents glowed with pride, their faces shining with the reflected success of their son. I slipped away toward the tall windows that overlooked the city. The Thames shimmered in the distance, catching the lights of passing cars. For a moment, I stood there in silence, watching the world move beyond the glass. My reflection stared back at me, dark hair, dark eyes, a quiet smile that held more secrets than anyone here could guess. It struck me then with a calm finality. This dinner, this performance, this carefully curated world, they were all about Alexander, about tradition, about the Vaughan legacy. But the real story was not being told at this table. It was waiting just beneath the surface, and soon it would rise. I turned back once, letting my gaze sweep across the room. My family laughed, oblivious, still wrapped in the comfort of the narrative they had built around themselves. They had no idea that the ground beneath them was already shifting. I walked toward the door, my footsteps light against the marble. The night air outside carried the faint chill of autumn, crisp and steady. I inhaled deeply, the city's hum filling my lungs, and I smiled, because the truth was simple. They did not know me yet, but they would. The night after Alexander's engagement dinner, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling where faint streaks of light from the city bled through the blinds. The laughter from that chandeliered hall still echoed in my ears. It was the same sound I had grown up with, a chorus of approval that had always been reserved for someone else. I closed my eyes, and the memories came rushing back, not in neat order, but like shards of glass scattered across the years. I was a child again, sitting at our long dining table in Boston, my legs swinging under the chair because they could not yet touch the floor. My father was speaking about his latest surgery, my mother about a case she had won in court, and Alexander about a prize he had taken home from school. The air buzzed with accomplishment. When it was my turn, I had tried to offer something small. I remember saying I had built a little program on the family computer, something that could calculate multiplication tables faster than I could write them down. My heart had raced as I waited for their reaction. My mother had smiled politely, not lifting her eyes from her wine. "That's cute," she had said, "but you really should focus on pre-law. That is more practical." Practical. That word had followed me for years like a shadow. What they meant by practical was controllable. A profession with clear paths, with rules they understood, with outcomes they could predict. But what I felt, even as a girl, was that their practicality was a cage. I remembered another morning, sliding a sheet of paper with lines of code beneath my father's newspaper. I wanted him to ask me about it, to see me. He did not even glance down. He moved the page aside to reach his coffee, and in that silence I learned how it felt to be invisible. By the time Alexander got into medical school, they threw a celebration that seemed to last for weeks. Guests came in and out, glasses clinked, toasts rang through the house. That same week I had qualified for the state tech finals. I begged them to come, but my mother said gently, "Maybe next time, sweetie. We already have plans for your brother." So I went alone, stood under the bright lights of the auditorium without a single familiar face in the crowd, and when I won first place, I carried the trophy back to my room like a secret. I kept it in my closet, tucked behind shoes, a reminder that even if no one else noticed, I was becoming someone. The cracks had started there, in those quiet omissions, in those glances that slid past me like I was furniture in the room. They never shouted at me, never told me outright that I was worthless. They simply ignored me, and somehow that hurt more. In college, I tasted freedom for the first time. I had chosen a small but rigorous tech school far from Boston, a place where no one knew the Vaughn name. There, I was not Alexander's sister. I was just Alois, the girl who saw code the way other people saw language. For once, my worth was measured not by a last name, but by what I could build with my hands and my mind. It was there that I met Clara Winslow. She was restless, curious, relentless in her pursuit of something bigger than the life mapped out for her. We found each other in a late-night study lab, the kind of accidental collision that changes everything. We stayed up until dawn many nights, sketching ideas on napkins, scribbling equations on whiteboards, writing code on laptops balanced on our knees. We were not chasing grades. We were chasing possibility. The idea that became our company was born on one of those nights. Clara had lost her uncle to a medication error. I had watched my grandmother misdiagnosed 3 times before anyone got it right. We looked at each other, at the brokenness in the system, and we knew we could at least try to mend one fracture. We imagined a secure, intuitive platform that would bridge the disastrous communication gaps in healthcare. A platform that could save lives quietly, invisibly, before errors could destroy families. While other students lined up internships at safe companies, Clara and I built prototypes in her garage. We survived on takeout, borrowed Wi-Fi, and the sheer conviction that what we were doing mattered. Her parents encouraged us, brought us snacks, asked questions about our progress. Mine pretended not to notice, still clinging to the belief that I was drifting, that eventually I would return to something practical. I let them believe it. It was easier than listening to another lecture about backup plans. By senior year, we had won a statewide entrepreneurship competition. The prize money paid our incorporation fees. A professor introduced us to our first hospital client. That contract changed everything. Lying in bed that night after the dinner, staring at the ceiling, I thought of those first sparks of belief. Of Clara's voice at 2 in the morning, insisting that what we were building mattered. of the patient stories that haunted us, of the faces we swore we would honor with our work. And I thought of my family, still convinced I was a wandering shadow. The cracks in memory were not just wounds. They were the fault lines that had shaped the ground beneath me. And one day, I knew those cracks would split wide open. When I think back on those years, I see them not as a straight line, but as fragments stitched together by exhaustion and stubborn belief. Clara and I lived in a cramped apartment above a corner store, its walls thin enough that we could hear the arguments of the couple next door and the clatter of deliveries at dawn. The rent was more than we could handle, so one month when we fell short, we offered to build our landlord a website in exchange for grace. He agreed, though he laughed when we told him what we were really working on. Nobody believed two young women in their early 20s could shake an industry that had resisted change for decades. But disbelief was a kind of fuel. Every smirk, every dismissive shrug, every suggestion that we should aim smaller, it all became fire under our skin. We coded through the nights, fueled by cheap coffee and the strange certainty that we were right. I would sit cross-legged on the floor with wires sprawled around me like tangled vines, Clara pacing with her laptop open, mumbling half-formed ideas as though speaking them aloud would make them real. There was no glamour in those days. My bank account hovered near zero more often than not. We patched together meals from leftovers, wore the same clothes until they thinned, and celebrated tiny victories with dollar store wine. And yet, I was happier than I had ever been under my parents' roof. Because here, no one was measuring me against Alexander. No one was reminding me of practical futures or safe choices. Here, every ounce of my energy went into something I believed in. The first time a hospital administrator took us seriously, I nearly cried. Dr. Simone Kwan was her name. She had an eye for innovation and a willingness to take risks that others lacked. She saw not just two exhausted young women with laptops, but the potential of what we had built. She signed a small contract, not enough to make us rich, but enough to give us legitimacy. That contract became the seed from which everything else grew. I did not tell my parents. When my mother called, her voice brisk and commanding, she asked if I had considered law school applications again. When I said I was still freelancing in tech, she sighed as though I were a child refusing to clean my room. My father rarely called at all. When he did, he asked if I needed money, but his tone made it sound less like concern and more like he was extending a hand to someone drifting without direction. I thanked him, declined, and returned to my work. It was easier to let them think I was wandering than to expose something so sacred to their doubt. I remember once, when the company had just crossed 100,000 users, my cousin sent a family email chain bragging about Alexander's promotion at the hospital. My mother replied with paragraphs of praise. My father added details of Alexander's brilliance. When it was my turn to respond, I simply wrote congratulations and hit send. I could have said more. I could have told them that my company was quietly transforming communication in hospitals across the country, that our software was preventing mistakes before they happened, that lives were already safer because of what Clara and I had built. But I knew it would not matter. They would not understand. And perhaps worse, they would not care until the world told them it was valuable. Recognition, I was learning, meant nothing if it came too late. What mattered was conviction, the unshakable belief that what I was building mattered, even when no one else clapped. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of our apartment, listening to Clara's steady breathing from the other side of the room. The weight of failure pressed on me so heavily I thought it might crush me. What if we were wrong? What if all our effort collapsed into nothing more than lines of code forgotten on a hard drive? But then I thought of my grandmother, misdiagnosed again and again, her body weakened by errors that should have been prevented. I thought of Clara's uncle, gone too soon because of a communication breakdown that could have been avoided. Those memories steadied me, like anchors in storm water. They reminded me why we kept going. One night, Clara turned to me with a half-smile, her face pale from lack of sleep. "Even if no one ever knows our names," she said, we will know. We will know we tried. We will know we did not waste our lives sitting quietly while the world stayed broken." Her words sank into me like stone. For years, I had lived in the shadow of needing to be seen, needing to be recognized, needing my parents to turn toward me with pride. That night, I realized maybe I did not need their eyes on me at all. Maybe the only eyes I needed were my own, staring into the mirror and knowing I had not betrayed myself. Lying in my bed after Alexander's engagement dinner, years later, I let those memories roll through me like a tide. The cracks of childhood, the fractures of silence, the long nights of hunger and code, All of it had shaped me into someone my family still did not recognize. But soon they would. I rolled onto my side, the city's glow pressing faint lines of light across the wall. Sleep did not come easily. My mind replayed the way Madeline had spoken about that acquisition deal, her voice calm, her words carrying weight. She did not know it yet, but the company she was chasing was mine. And the moment she connected the dots, everything would change. I closed my eyes and let the thought settle in my chest like a secret too heavy to hold. My family had spent a lifetime underestimating me. They thought I was invisible, forgettable, a shadow beside Alexander's brilliance. But the world was already learning who I was. And the Vaughns, whether they liked it or not, were about to learn too. The morning after the dinner, I dragged myself into the office with a knot in my stomach and the faint taste of champagne still clinging to my tongue. Our office was not the glass tower people imagine when they hear the word startup. It was a converted warehouse on the South Bank, with exposed brick walls, leaky pipes, and a draft that made the winters brutal. But when I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped inside, I felt a quiet pride I could never summon at my parents' house. This space was mine. The hum of servers greeted me, mixed with the faint smell of coffee and the clutter of whiteboards scrawled with lines of code, diagrams, half-erased notes from meetings that had stretched long into the night. Clara was already there, perched on a desk with her laptop balanced on her knees, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She glanced up when I entered, her eyes sharp behind smudged glasses. "Late night?" she asked, smirking. "Family dinner," I replied, dropping my coat onto a chair. Her smirk softened. "Ah, enough said." Clara had been around long enough to understand. She had seen the way my family hovered like distant judges, always watching, never applauding. She had been there the first time I admitted I had never told my parents what we were building. She never pushed me to, never questioned it. She just nodded and said, "Then we'll build until they cannot ignore you even if they try." I sat down at my desk, opening my laptop. The inbox was full. Investor updates, bug reports, potential clients, the endless stream of communication that had come to define my days. And there, among the noise, was another email from Horizon Technologies, Madeline's company. The subject line was polite, professional, strategic alignment discussion. I clicked it open and scanned the words. Their interest was serious, their valuation generous. They wanted to arrange another meeting, to explore how our platform could integrate into their global portfolio. I stared at the email, my pulse rising. I could still hear Madeline's voice from the night before, speaking casually at the dinner table about the deal her firm was negotiating. She had no idea the founder she was chasing had been sitting across from her, dressed in black, raising a glass without a word. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Clara looked over. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said quickly, then shook my head. "Not nothing. Horizon, they want another meeting." Her eyebrows shot up. That was fast. "Yeah," I muttered, "they are serious." We had been approached before, other companies circling, acquisition offers dangled in front of us like bait. We had turned them down each time, but Horizon was different. They were huge, with resources we could only dream of, a network that spanned continents. Working with them could change everything. And yet the irony was unbearable. Madeline was leading the negotiation. My brother's fiancée. My parents' new golden daughter-in-law. The secret was tightening like a knot in my chest. I pushed the thought away and opened a bug report, letting my eyes scan lines of code until the tension eased. Work had always been my escape, the one place where my family's voices could not follow me. Here, in the rhythm of logic and language, I was free. Around noon, the team gathered for lunch, crowded around a table covered with takeout boxes. Tyler, our back-end genius, was explaining some optimization he had been working on, his hands moving as fast as his words. Clara listened intently, interrupting only to correct a minor detail. Jules, our UX designer, added a joke that made everyone laugh. I looked around the table at them, at this mismatched group of people who had chosen to believe in something invisible. They were not my family by blood, but in so many ways they were more. They asked questions, they listened, they cared, and yet even here the shadow of my family lingered. I could not stop thinking about the dinner, about Madeline's words, about the storm that was coming whether I wanted it or not. That night, when the others had gone home and the office was quiet again, I sat alone at my desk. The city outside glowed through the warehouse windows, a patchwork of lights against the dark. I opened the Horizon email once more, rereading the lines until the words blurred. This was it, the first domino. If I said yes to another meeting, the odds of remaining anonymous would vanish. Madeline would connect the dots. My parents would find out. Alexander would be forced to see me, not as the shadow of a sister, but as the woman standing on the opposite side of his fiancée in a billion-dollar negotiation. I closed the laptop, pressing my palms against the cool surface. The irony was bitter. For years I had hidden from their eyes, protecting myself from their dismissal. Now the truth was circling closer and closer, and I could feel the inevitability of its collision. In the stillness of that warehouse, I whispered to myself, they are going to know. And for the first time in years, the thought did not terrify me. It thrilled me. The days that followed blurred into one another, a familiar rhythm of code, meetings, and the relentless push to keep everything from collapsing. Startups were never built in clean, glamorous strokes. They were patched together with duct tape and determination, one crisis at a time. By midweek, we were staring down a server outage that threatened to lock thousands of hospital staff out of the system. Tyler had dark circles under his eyes, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he tried to trace the error. Clara was pacing again, phone pressed to her ear as she assured clients we were handling it. I sat beside Tyler, combing through lines of code until the numbers swam before me. We fixed it after 18 straight hours, and when the system came back online, the three of us cheered like we had just landed a rocket on the moon. We ordered greasy pizza, sat on the floor, and ate until exhaustion dragged us under. There was no time for champagne in this world, no time for polished speeches. Our victories came in silence, measured by the fact that lives were safer today than they had been yesterday. It was in those moments that I remembered why I had chosen this path. Not for money, not for recognition, but because somewhere out there a nurse could enter a patient's medication without fear of fatal errors, because a doctor could access critical data without delay. That mattered more than applause. Still, the Horizon email burned in my mind. I kept it hidden, a private weight in my inbox. I hadn't even told Clara yet. She deserved to know, but I wasn't ready. Not when the name attached to it was Madeline Caro, the woman soon to marry my brother. On Thursday, as the office quieted and the team trickled out, Clara lingered. She studied me with that perceptive gaze of hers, the one that saw through most of my walls. Something on your mind, she said. I hesitated. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the Horizon email. Her eyes widened as she read. Horizon, she whispered. Eloise, this is huge. I nodded slowly. That's not the only thing. Her eyes flicked to mine, waiting. Their lead on this negotiation, the one reaching out, she's engaged to my brother. For a moment, Clara just stared at me, lips parted in shock. You're kidding. I shook my head. I wish I were. She sat back, running a hand through her hair. Wow, that's complicated. I let out a humorless laugh. That's one word for it. The room fell quiet. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the warehouse windows, but inside the air felt heavier, as though the weight of this secret had filled every corner. Clara finally leaned forward. Do you want this deal? I thought of all the offers we had already turned down. Smaller companies had wanted to absorb us, to dilute what we had built into something more marketable. We had always said no. But Horizon was different. They had the reach to scale us across continents, to touch millions instead of thousands. I admitted, but not if it means losing what makes us us. Clara nodded. Then that's where we start. We hold the line. Her words steadied me, but they didn't untangle the knot in my chest, because I knew what was coming. If this moved forward, if Horizon kept pushing, if Madeline finally connected the dots, the walls I had built between my family and my work would crumble. That night, walking home through the London streets, the thought echoed in my head like a drumbeat. They're going to know. I passed shop windows reflecting my figure, dark hair loose around my face, black coat wrapped tight. In those reflections, I did not look like the invisible daughter, the forgotten sibling. I looked like someone standing at the edge of a revelation. And then the twist, sharp and undeniable, settled into place. Madeline wasn't just talking about any startup at that dinner. She was talking about mine. Horizon wasn't chasing some faceless founder in the shadows. They were chasing me. The Vaughns didn't know it yet. Alexander didn't know it yet. But soon, when Madeline discovered the truth, my name would no longer be the quiet afterthought at the dinner table. It would be the headline. And nothing, not family pride, not silence, not years of being ignored, would ever look the same again. Growth did not arrive in a flash of light. It came in slow, deliberate waves, the kind you only notice when you look back and realize the shoreline has shifted. In the months after Horizon's first approach, we began to land contracts we had only dreamed of before. Word spread quietly through hospital networks, administrators recommending us to one another in the way people do when they stumble across something that works. A physician in Manchester told a colleague in Edinburgh. A nurse in Dublin mentioned us to a friend in London. Suddenly, our inbox overflowed with inquiries. We hired more developers, doubling our team, then doubling again. The warehouse that had once felt cavernous now burst with energy. Whiteboards filled faster than we could erase them. Empty coffee cups multiplied on every desk. At night, when the others left, I would sometimes walk the aisles between the rows of monitors, running my fingers across the backs of chairs, marveling at what we had created from nothing but conviction. And yet, even as we climbed, I kept my silence. My mother called one afternoon while I was between meetings. She asked, as she always did, whether I had thought more seriously about law. I could hear her tapping on her keyboard in the background, multitasking as though our conversation were just another appointment in her calendar. I told her I was busy with work, vague as always. She sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment, then shifted back to praising Alexander's latest publication. My father emailed me a few days later with a link to a job opening at a consultancy firm. Stable, he wrote in the subject line. Reliable. I closed the email without replying. It should not have hurt anymore, but it did, because part of me still wanted them to ask the right questions, to pause long enough to wonder what I was actually building, to stop assuming and start listening. But they never did, so I let the silence stretch between us and poured myself deeper into the company. By the time I turned 30, our platform was in more than 100 hospitals. We had raised millions in funding, enough to finally move into a real office with glass walls overlooking the Thames. Investors began to call me visionary. Journalists wrote about the mysterious founder who refused to appear in photographs, who declined interviews, who let the work speak louder than her name. I liked the myth of it, the ghost founder. It gave me a shield, a way to stay hidden from the people who had never cared to look anyway. One evening, Clara and I stood in our new office watching the lights ripple across the river. She nudged me with her elbow. Remember when we couldn't pay rent? I laughed softly. I remember bribing the landlord with a website. She grinned. Look at us now. We clinked our glasses, not champagne but cheap Prosecco poured into mismatched mugs because some habits never die. For a moment the silence between us was full, not empty, carrying the weight of all we had survived. But even in that moment of triumph, a shadow lingered in my mind. Because success, no matter how wide it stretched, still lived in secrecy. My family's ignorance was not protection anymore. It was denial. And denial, like all walls, eventually cracks. The next morning, I opened my inbox to find another message from Horizon. They were pressing harder now, eager to schedule a formal round of negotiations. The name at the bottom of the email was Madeline Caro. I sat back in my chair, staring at the letters of her name glowing on the screen. My brother's fiancée. The woman my parents adored. The woman they praised for her accomplishments, her refinement, her future. She was chasing me, and she didn't even know it yet. I closed the laptop slowly. The secret was fraying. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep it hidden any longer. The pressure of growth was intoxicating and exhausting all at once. Our platform spread through hospitals faster than we could have anticipated, each new client pushing us to adapt, to innovate, to stretch beyond what we thought was possible. At times, it felt like running a marathon while building the road beneath our feet. I woke before sunrise most mornings, the sky still dark outside my apartment window, and by the time I returned home, the city lights had already blinked awake. My life became a rhythm of glowing screens and conference calls, strategy sessions, and frantic bug fixes. Clara thrived in the chaos, her energy unyielding, her mind always leaping 3 steps ahead. Tyler found joy in the problems no one else wanted to touch, wrestling with back-end tangles until he emerged victorious. Jules designed interfaces so intuitive that nurses wrote us thank you emails for making their lives easier. I often stood back and watched them with a quiet awe. This was the family I had chosen, one built not on blood but on belief. They celebrated victories no one outside these walls understood. They carried each other when exhaustion threatened to drag us under. They asked questions my parents never thought to ask, and yet, no matter how high we climbed, the silence of my real family followed me like a shadow. At Christmas, the Vaughns gathered in the same house where I had once hidden my trophy in the closet. My mother fussed over the tree, my father poured wine, Alexander told stories from the hospital that had everyone leaning forward wide-eyed. When the conversation turned to me, it was always the same careful politeness. Eloise is doing some work in tech, my father would say vaguely, or my mother would add, she's freelancing, exploring options. Their voices carried a strange mix of dismissal and pity, as though I were a child still searching for a direction. I never corrected them. It was easier to sip my wine, smile thinly, and let them believe the lie. But sometimes, when I lay awake later that night, I wondered what it would feel like to tell the truth. To see their faces when I explained that our platform had already prevented thousands of errors in hospitals across Europe, that investors were chasing us, that analysts valued our work in the hundreds of millions. I imagined their shock, their pride, their regret. And then I turned away from the thought, because I knew pride built on ignorance was hollow. Recognition had to be chosen freely. Otherwise, it was only another performance. Still, Horizon's interest made denial harder. Their emails arrived regularly now, each one more insistent than the last. They wanted meetings, data, forecasts. They wanted us. And every time I saw Madeline's signature at the bottom, I felt the walls closing in. One evening, long after the office had emptied, Clara and I sat by the windows watching the river shift in the wind. The city was quiet, its lights flickering like signals against the dark. Clara broke the silence first. "You can't hide forever," she said. I kept my gaze on the water. "I know." She leaned back in her chair, her face lit by the glow of her laptop. "But maybe you don't have to hide anymore." Her words sank into me. For years, I had kept my success separate from my family, convinced that secrecy was protection. But now, secrecy was becoming a weight of its own, pressing harder with every email from Horizon. I turned to Clara then, searching her expression. "What if they only care once the world tells them I'm worth caring about?" She shrugged. "Then you'll know." The simplicity of it made me laugh, though the sound was soft, almost brittle. She was right. The truth was coming whether I wanted it or not. Madeline was circling closer. My family would learn who I really was. The question was no longer if, it was when. As I packed up my bag that night, the warehouse silent around us, I realized the silence I had clung to for so long was already unraveling. My company had outgrown the shadows. My life had outgrown invisibility. Sooner or later, the Vaughns would see me. And I wondered, with a shiver that was equal parts dread and anticipation, what would break first, them or me. The day it began to unravel was not dramatic at first. It was a Tuesday, gray and damp, the kind of London morning that pressed fog against the glass of our office windows. I had been up all night preparing slides for a hospital board presentation, my eyes gritty, my head buzzing from too much coffee. By 9 o'clock, the team was gathering, voices overlapping, laptops opening, the usual symphony of our mornings. Then Clara walked in holding a folded newspaper. Her face was unreadable as she set it down on my desk. The headline stretched across the top in bold letters. Horizon eyes major acquisition in healthcare tech. My stomach dropped. The article was not about us by name, not yet. It described the surge of innovation in medical communications platforms, the wave of companies racing to fix systemic problems. It quoted anonymous sources about valuations climbing into the hundreds of millions. And at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, was a single line. Horizon's director of strategic acquisitions, Madeline Caro, declined to name the company but emphasized its transformative impact. I stared at the words until they blurred. Clara leaned close, lowering her voice. "This is it, Alois." "She's circling." I nodded slowly, though my hands felt cold. It was one thing to hide behind silence when the world did not care. It was another to pretend invisibility when newspapers were circling, when my brother's fiancée was giving interviews about the deal. The walls I had built around my life were buckling, cracks spreading faster than I could patch them. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Dinner this weekend," she wrote. "We'll be hosting the Caros. Bring something nice to wear." I sat frozen, the irony sharp as glass. Madeline was not only hunting me professionally, she was about to sit across from me again in my parents' dining room. The night of the dinner, I chose my dress carefully. Black again, simple, strong. My mother greeted me at the door with her usual brisk smile, her eyes sweeping over me as if checking for flaws. Alexander kissed my cheek, his attention already half on Madeline, who glowed in a sapphire gown. The Caros were polished, poised, exactly the kind of family my parents admired. We sat down at the long mahogany table, candles flickering, silver polished to a mirror shine. My father launched immediately into a toast about the importance of family legacies, his voice resonant, his eyes alight with pride for Alexander. My mother chimed in with a story about his first surgical rotation. Laughter rose, glasses clinked. And then, like a current shifting beneath calm water, the conversation turned toward work. Madeline's father spoke proudly of her role at Horizon, of her brilliance in navigating complex negotiations. My parents listened with glowing admiration, their nods eager, their questions endless. Madeline answered gracefully, her eyes bright, her tone practiced. But as she spoke about a company we are close to acquiring, her gaze flickered, just for an instant, toward me. It was subtle, a half-second glance, but I felt it like a spotlight. I forced my face into neutrality, cutting my lamb with slow precision, as though nothing in the world mattered more than the angle of my knife. But inside, my pulse hammered. Did she know? Or was it only coincidence? As dessert was served, my uncle leaned across the table. Alois, he said in that booming voice of his, Alexander tells me you're still, what is it again? Freelancing? The room chuckled politely. My cheeks burned, but I smiled faintly. Something like that, I murmured. It was then that Madeline spoke, her fork pausing midair. Freelancing? She asked lightly, tilting her head. In tech? Yes, I said evenly, healthcare technology. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, the kind of narrowing only someone with a sharp mind could manage. How interesting, she said. Healthcare is such a dynamic space right now. I held her gaze across the flicker of candlelight. Neither of us looked away. In that suspended silence, something shifted. She hadn't connected the final dots yet, but suspicion had sparked. And once suspicion ignites, it only grows. When the dinner ended and coats were fetched, she slipped close to me by the door. Her voice was low, almost casual. I hope we'll have a chance to talk more, Alois. Professional to professional. The words struck like a match. I smiled, calm on the surface, though my heart thudded in my chest. Of course, I said. Anytime. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the truth pressed against my ribs with merciless force. The secret was slipping through my fingers. Madeline was beginning to see me. And when she did, the Vaughns would see me too. The week passed in a blur of restless energy. Horizon's emails grew sharper, more urgent. Madeline's name kept appearing in my inbox, polite but insistent. Each message was another thread tugging at the fabric of the life I had kept separate. I answered carefully, strategically, but always under the shield of our company's formal channels. Still, the pressure mounted. By the time Saturday arrived, my chest felt tight with the weight of inevitability. The Vaughns were gathering again, this time at an upscale restaurant in Mayfair, chosen, no doubt, to impress the Caros. I told myself it would be another evening of polished small talk, another performance of Alexander's brilliance. I told myself Madeline might not say anything, but I knew better. The dining room shimmered with glass and marble, its chandeliers dripping light across tables dressed in linen. My parents sat at the center of it all, their posture regal, their voices warm with anticipation. Alexander was radiant as always, his arm around Madeline, his smile perfectly placed. I took my seat quietly, a few chairs down, prepared to endure. The evening began the way they all did, toasts to Alexander, anecdotes about his patience, admiration for his fiancée. My father raised his glass, his words flowing with pride, my mother's eyes glistening as she spoke of legacy and excellence. Guests applauded, laughter rippled, and I sat in silence, sipping wine that tasted faintly of iron. But then came the moment. It was Madeline who broke the rhythm. She set her fork down gently, her gaze sweeping the table before settling on me, her head tilted, curiosity sharpening her features. Alois, she said aloud, your last name is Vaughn, isn't it? The room quieted. Yes, I replied evenly, though my pulse thundered. Her eyes narrowed slightly, recognition flickering behind them. Vaughn, she paused as though sifting through mental files. You're Alois Vaughn. The silence deepened. My mother's smile froze. My father's wine glass halted halfway to his lips. Alexander turned to Madeline, confused. Madeline leaned forward, her voice steady but edged with surprise. You're not just in healthcare tech. You're the founder of AegisLink. Every fork, every glass, every breath seemed to still. I felt the weight of a dozen eyes on me, my family's disbelief crashing like waves. I held Madeline's gaze, calm, unflinching. Yes, I am. The air snapped taut. My mother's fingers clutched at her necklace, her face pale. My father's mouth opened, closed, then opened again as if words had deserted him. Alexander stared at me as though I were a stranger. Madeline's eyes flicked between me and him. You didn't know? She asked, incredulous. Alexander's lips parted, but no sound emerged. The table erupted in whispers, relatives craning forward, eyes wide. My uncle muttered something about hearing of AegisLink in the Financial Times. My cousin gaped as though I had sprouted wings. My mother was the first to find her voice. Alois, she stammered, is this true? I met her gaze, steady as stone. It is. And then the flood began. Questions spilled from every side, about funding, about hospitals, about why I had never told them. My father insisted he had always known I was capable, though his tone rang hollow. My mother claimed she had suspected something, though her eyes betrayed shock. But I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was already louder than their disbelief. Across the table, Alexander sat motionless, his hand limp on the tablecloth, his glass untouched. His fiancée had just revealed a truth he had never imagined, and I could see the storm building behind his eyes. Madeline, to her credit, recovered quickly. She offered a small smile, tinged with apology. "Your platform has changed lives," she said softly, almost only to me. "I understand now why your team guards it so fiercely." Her words struck deeper than any praise my family had ever given. When the dinner ended, I walked out into the night without looking back. The city air was sharp, bracing. For years I had wondered what it would feel like when they finally saw me. Now I knew. And it did not change who I was. The morning after the dinner, I woke before dawn, long before the sun rose over the Thames. I lay still in bed, staring at the pale ceiling of my apartment, the silence thick around me. Sleep had been restless, haunted by the frozen expressions on my parents' faces, the sharp disbelief in Alexander's eyes, the way Madeline's words had cracked open a truth I could no longer conceal. When my phone buzzed on the nightstand, I already knew who it would be. The first message was from my mother. "We need to talk. Brunch tomorrow. Ritz Hotel, 11 o'clock. Dress appropriately." Her words were brisk, efficient, but I could read the undercurrent pulsing between the lines, a mixture of shock, hunger, and maybe, just maybe, pride she would never admit outright. The second was from my father. "Proud of you. Let's catch up soon." 2 sentences. It was almost laughable. All those years of silence, of dismissive sighs and half-hearted advice, and now he was proud of me because someone else had forced him to see me. The third arrived hours later, simple and stark. "Why didn't you tell me?" Alexander's message made me pause. I read it again and again, staring at the 3 words as though they might rearrange themselves into something easier. But they didn't. The question hung heavy in my chest, one I wasn't ready to answer. Still, when Sunday arrived, I dressed carefully and went to the Ritz. The dining room gleamed with white tablecloths and polished silver. My parents were already seated when I arrived, their posture sharp, their clothes immaculate as if they were preparing for trial. My mother's pearls caught the light, her expression taut with the effort of composure. My father wore a navy blazer and the faint smell of cologne that always reminded me of childhood mornings when he left for the hospital before sunrise. They both rose as I approached. My father leaned in for a half-hug, stiff and unfamiliar, while my mother brushed her lips against my cheek. "Eloise," my father said, his voice too smooth, too formal. "You look well." I sat, folded the napkin across my lap, and waited. The waiter poured coffee, the quiet between us like a stretched wire. Finally, my mother spoke. "I've been reading," she said. Her tone was brisk, but her hands betrayed a faint tremor as she lifted her cup. "About your company, the awards, the funding rounds, the hospitals you serve. It's remarkable." She paused, studying me as though she had never seen me before. "But why didn't you tell us?" I stirred cream into my coffee, letting the silence stretch before I answered. "Because the last time I tried," I said evenly, "you told me to apply for a job answering phones." The words landed like a stone. My father flinched, his jaw tightening. "That's not fair. We were trying to help." "No," I corrected him, meeting his gaze. "You were trying to fix something that wasn't broken." My mother's lips parted, then pressed shut again. The waiter arrived with pastries, setting them between us, and for a moment the clink of porcelain filled the space where her voice had failed. "We just didn't understand," she admitted finally, softer now. The tech world seemed unstable. "Risky. And medicine is," I asked. "Law is, that's different," she insisted. "Those are structured." "That's what scared you," I said quietly. "I chose something you couldn't control." Her eyes flickered, and my father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked down at his plate, as if the croissant crumbs might provide an answer. For the first time in my life, I saw doubt in his face. The surgeon who had always believed himself infallible, suddenly uncertain. "We love you," my mother said then, almost pleading. I nodded, my voice steady. "I know, but love without respect doesn't feel like love." The silence that followed was brittle, fragile as spun glass. No one moved. I could almost hear the clatter of plates from other tables, the distant murmur of conversations that had nothing to do with us. For a moment it felt as though the 3 of us were sitting in a snow globe, sealed off from the rest of the world, suspended in unresolved truths. When the tension finally eased, my father cleared his throat. "Tell us, then. Tell us what you've been building." So I did. Not everything, but enough. I spoke about Clara, about our first hospital contract, about the all-night coding sessions and the victories that had come quietly, far from their gaze. My mother leaned forward, asking questions with real curiosity. My father listened, nodding occasionally, though his eyes carried a weight I could not read. At one point, my mother admitted she had tried reading a blog about startup culture but couldn't make sense of half the acronyms. I almost laughed, though the sound stuck in my throat. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard her say. When brunch ended, there were no hugs, no sudden reconciliations, just a tentative plan to meet again for dinner the following week. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. But it was a beginning. That evening, as the city darkened and lights flickered to life across the river, there was a knock at my apartment door. Alexander stood there, holding a bottle of wine and a bakery box. His smile was small, sheepish. "I tried baking," he said. "It went badly, so I bought backups." We sat on the floor, backs against the couch, just like when we were children. He poured the wine into mismatched glasses and handed me a slice of cake. The skyline glittered beyond the window, 1,000 lights shimmering across the glass. "I need to say this," he began without preamble. "I'm sorry." I turned to him, startled. "I believed what Mom and Dad believed," he admitted, "that you were drifting. That you wasted your chance." He shook his head, his voice low. "But you weren't lost. You were building something they couldn't see, and I never asked. That's on me." His words settled deep in my chest. "You weren't the only one," I said softly. "Maybe not," he replied. "But I'm the only one here now." He raised his glass to the black sheep. I touched mine to his, a faint smile pulling at my lips, to the sheep that built an empire. For the first time in years, our laughter rose together, unguarded, warm. And yet, even as I savored that fragile connection, my phone buzzed on the table. Another email from Horizon, another message from Madeline. The warmth faded into unease, because I knew, as sure as I knew my own name, that the true confrontation had not yet begun. The email from Horizon sat unopened for hours. I worked around it, circling through code reviews, strategy calls, budget updates, anything to avoid the inevitable. But by late evening, I could no longer ignore it. I clicked. "Eloise, we are prepared to move forward. The board is unanimous. Horizon wants EgisLink and we want you leading the transition. Let's meet in person to finalize terms." Madeline Carrot, her name glowed at the bottom like a flare. It was no longer a polite inquiry. It was an invitation, a demand, a warning. I called Clara immediately. She answered on the second ring, voice sharp with exhaustion. "Don't tell me we've got another server crash." "Worse," I said. "Horizon's ready to make their move." There was silence, then a slow exhale. "Madeline, yes, when? Tomorrow. They want to meet in their London office." "We should go," Clara said. "At least hear them out." I hesitated. "If I walk into that room, it won't just be business. It'll be personal." "It already is," she replied. The next day, I stepped into Horizon's headquarters, a glass tower slicing into the sky. The lobby was a sea of marble and chrome, filled with the hum of ambition. A receptionist led us to a sleek conference room on the 32nd floor, its walls floor-to-ceiling windows, the Thames stretched wide below. Madeline was waiting. She rose as we entered, every inch the polished executive, her sapphire eyes sharp, her handshake firm. But there was a flicker of something else when her gaze met mine, recognition, caution, maybe even respect. "Eloise," she said smoothly. "Thank you for coming." Clara and I sat opposite her, the river glinting behind her like a blade. Madeline launched into the pitch with practiced ease, outlining Horizon's resources, their global reach, the hospitals they could put us in overnight. Her voice was steady, her logic impeccable. But underneath, I could hear the strain, because she knew what I knew. This wasn't just a negotiation, it was a collision course. When she finished, she leaned back, folding her hands. "We believe EgisLink could save lives on a scale no one else can match. Horizon can make that happen." I held her gaze. "At what cost?" Her expression didn't flicker. Integration always has challenges. "And ownership," I pressed. "Would Horizon swallow us whole or let us keep what makes us different?" Her silence was answer enough. Clara jumped in then, her tone sharp. "We didn't build this to become another cog in a machine." The room tightened. Madeline's jaw flexed, her composure straining. "I understand," she said, "but sometimes scale requires sacrifice." I leaned forward, voice low. "Sacrifice for whom? For patients? For hospitals? Or for Horizon's shareholders?" Her eyes narrowed. "For the greater good." The air snapped between us, the unspoken truth hanging heavy. Her definition of good was not mine. When the meeting ended, Clara and I walked out without shaking hands. My chest burned, my pulse unsteady. This wasn't over, it had only begun. That night, Alexander showed up at my apartment unannounced. His face was pale, his expression stormy. "I spoke with Madeline," he said without preamble. "She told me everything." I crossed my arms, waiting. He stepped closer, voice rising. "Do you realize what you're doing? You're jeopardizing her career, her future, everything she's worked for." I laughed bitterly. "And what about mine, Alexander? What about the years I spent invisible to you, to all of you?" "This isn't about you," he snapped. "It's always about you," I shot back. "The golden sun, the family's pride. And now that I've built something bigger than your shadow, suddenly it's dangerous. Suddenly it's a problem." His jaw tightened, his eyes flashing. "She's my fiancée, and this is my life." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. He looked at me as though he no longer recognized me, as though the sister he thought he knew had been replaced by someone unyielding, unrelenting. Finally, he shook his head, his voice low. "If you go against Horizon, you go against her. And if you go against her, you go against me." Then he left, the door slamming behind him, leaving me standing in the echo of his words. The second twist had landed, as brutal as I had feared. This wasn't just business. This was family. And for the first time, I wondered if I would have to choose between them. The days that followed blurred into one long storm. Meetings stacked on meetings, journalists began calling, investors pressed for answers. The news cycle had caught fire with whispers of Horizon's acquisition hunt, and speculations swirled like smoke. Aegis Link's name had not yet been published, but it was only a matter of time. Inside our office, the tension was suffocating. Clara paced during calls, her voice sharp as she fought to keep control of the narrative. Tyler buried himself in code, headphones clamped over his ears, though I could see the worry flickering in his eyes each time he looked up. Jules sketched redesigns in silence, his usual lighthearted commentary gone. And me, I carried the weight of two worlds colliding. Horizon's proposal was still on the table. Madeline had followed up with a formal offer, glossy and precise, dangling a valuation higher than anything we had seen before. The numbers glittered, promising security, expansion, stability. But behind those numbers was a hollowing out, the slow death of the thing we had built. I knew what I wanted, to walk away. To guard what mattered. But Alexander's words haunted me. "If you go against her, you go against me." At night, I replayed them in the quiet of my apartment, the city buzzing beyond the windows. I thought of childhood afternoons when Alexander and I built forts out of blankets, when he told me scary stories by flashlight, when he held my hand after my first heartbreak. And I thought of the man who had stood in my doorway days ago, his voice cold, his loyalty pledged to someone else. The Vaughns, for all their pride, had always been fragile. We had never truly learned to speak to one another without barbs or masks. And now, when the truth demanded honesty, we were breaking under its weight. One evening, Clara called an emergency meeting. She stood at the front of the office, arms folded, eyes burning with urgency. "We need to decide," she said. "Horizon is circling harder. If we don't respond, they'll go public, and then this isn't just negotiation anymore, it's a spectacle." The room was silent. Finally, Tyler spoke, his voice tentative. "They could take us to every continent, millions of patients. At what cost?" Clara shot back. "We'd lose control. We'd lose ourselves." She turned to me then, her gaze fierce. "Eloise, this is your call. What do you want?" The question pressed against me like a knife. My team's future, my company's integrity, my family's fragile reconciliation, all of it balanced on my answer. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Family dinner tomorrow, no excuses." I felt the room watching me, waiting. My voice came low, steady. "I need one more day." The next evening, I walked into my parents' house with a stomach knotted tight. The Vaughns had gathered again, and this time the air was heavier than ever. My father stood stiffly by the fireplace, his glass of scotch untouched. My mother arranged plates at the table with brittle precision. Alexander sat across the room, jaw tight, his eyes avoiding mine. Madeline was beside him, immaculate as always, her expression unreadable. Dinner began in silence. Knives scraped against china, glasses clinked, but no one spoke. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "We've been talking," he said, "about your company, about Horizon." All eyes shifted to me. Alexander leaned forward, his voice clipped. "You should take the deal. It's the smart move." Clara's words echoed in my mind. At what cost? I looked at him, at all of them, and felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. My family, my company, my future, everything was on the line. And as the silence thickened, I realized this dinner was no longer about food or family. It was a battlefield. The air around that dinner table was heavier than any boardroom I had ever stepped into. My parents sat stiffly, their polished composure fraying at the edges. Alexander leaned forward, his hands clasped as though he were preparing to perform surgery. Madeline's gaze was steady, her every word chosen like a blade. And I sat across from them, my chest burning, my fingers tight around the stem of my glass. "You should take the deal," Alexander repeated, his voice clipped, final. "Horizon is offering you everything: stability, reach, a legacy that actually means something. Legacy." The word struck me like a stone. I thought of all the years I had spent in his shadow, the dinners where my name went unspoken, the trophies hidden in closets. Now he wanted to dictate my legacy too. Madeline's voice was softer, more measured. Alois, this isn't just about money. With Horizon, AegisLink could reach every hospital in Europe within 2 years. Imagine the lives that could be saved. And imagine the compromises I countered, the bureaucracy, the dilution. The mission warped into a marketing tool. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. And if that compromise saves 10 times the lives you're saving now? The table fell silent. Even my parents leaned in, waiting. I swallowed, steadying myself. Saving lives matters. But so does the way you save them. If you hand over everything to a system that doesn't care about people, only about margins, then sooner or later those lives become numbers again. That's what I built this company to fight. Alexander's jaw clenched. Always so dramatic. Always so blind, I shot back. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're throwing away the chance of a lifetime because of your pride. And you'd sell out the people we're supposed to protect because it makes for a cleaner story at cocktail parties. His face flushed, his hands trembling. You don't understand, you've never understood. I rose too, the tension vibrating through me. No, Alexander, you've never tried to understand me. The silence that followed was thunderous. My mother's hand flew to her pearls. My father's mouth opened, but no words came. Madeline's gaze darted between us, calculating, her calm mask finally cracking. I turned to her then, my voice low but steady. Madeline, Horizon can make its offers, but my answer is no. Her lips parted, shock flickering before she recovered. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said, but it will be my choice to regret. For a long moment she stared at me, then gathered her bag and stood. Come on, Alexander, she said quietly, but he didn't move. His fists were clenched at his sides, his face a storm. Finally he looked at me, his voice raw. You've destroyed everything. No, I told him. I just stopped letting everything destroy me. He turned away then, following Madeline out the door, the sound of it slamming echoing through the house like a gunshot. The silence left behind was suffocating. My parents sat frozen, staring at me as though I were someone they had never met. Maybe I was. I set my glass down and straightened. For years you didn't see me. Now you do. What you do with that is up to you. And then I walked out into the night. The air was cold, sharp in my lungs, but it felt like the first true breath I had taken in years. I stood on the pavement, the city alive around me, headlights streaming, voices spilling from pubs, the endless hum of life pressing forward. Behind me, the Vaughn's house glowed with its curated perfection, but it no longer held me. Ahead of me, the world stretched wide, my company, my team, the mission that mattered more than approval or legacy. For the first time, I felt whole, not invisible. Not forgotten, not the black sheep. I was Alois Vaughn, and they finally knew my name.